Hello, and welcome to the CivilTalk Podcast. I'm your host, Topacio Althaus. If you're new to the podcast, this is where we explore civility and social emotional learning in the modern world with esteemed guests, expert insights, and practical advice to help people navigate the world. Today on the show, we are excited to have Professor Kevin Gardiner joining us. Kevin is the director of UConn's Innovation Quest program, where he guides students in a workshop and competition that helps them develop their innovative ideas into businesses. He is also a professor in UConn's School of Business and College of Engineering. We're so excited to have Professor Gardiner on the show today to talk about civility and emotional intelligence within his field of work. Welcome, Professor Kevin Gardiner.
Hi, happy to be here.
Happy to have you. I've heard a lot about you from Keith and from the people at CivilTalk and of course at UConn. And I've dabbled a little bit in the Innovation Quest program on CivilTalk. So I'm really interested in your work and obviously to get the word out on what you're doing.
Great.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear more, just to start the show, I'd love to hear more about Innovation Quest, how you started, just your background with that. And I mean, you have a one-on-one experience with basically modern entrepreneurship amongst students. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so this was the 13th year of Innovation Quest, and I've been involved since around 2017. So I graduated from UConn many years ago. I moved around the country quite a bit, and my last stop prior to moving back to Connecticut was Chicago. And when I came back to Connecticut, an angel investor that I'd got connected with through UConn, I'd written some business plans for him. He invested in one of my startups, and we've just stayed in touch through the years. Told me about Innovation Quest. He said they're often looking for judges and mentors for the students, and thought it might be interesting to me. And it was. I loved every second of being involved in Innovation Quest that first year. One-on-one mentor sessions with the students, and then judging the final presentations. And so I continued to do it from 2017 on, uninterrupted. And then after last year's Innovation Quest 2023, Rich Dino, who had been the director for the last 12 years, he was ready to pass the baton, and him and Keith asked me if I'd be interested in being the director of the program. And so I jumped at the opportunity because I've loved being a part of it as a mentor and judge, and it was a great first year being the director of the program.
Right. So the program involves you basically having a one-on-one relationship with most of your students and directing them in their entrepreneurship goals. Is this correct?
Yeah, it's been great to see it evolve. I think when it started, certainly when entrepreneurship was getting going at UConn in the early 2000s, it was mostly restricted to the School of Business. And this has continued to evolve to the point where this year we had students from, I think, 66 different majors and different colleges and schools throughout UConn. So it's much broader than the School of Business now. And so you start to get really interesting ideas and better formed teams, because you'll often have an engineer with a business student, potentially a med student, et cetera, a design student. And so we get students from all backgrounds. They could be a first year freshman, they could be a PhD candidate. And we work with them. They sit through about 4 online workshops and then decide if they want to apply into the program. And this year we had about 55 applicants that we whittled down to 14 final presentations, and ultimately welcomed 8 into our summer incubator.
Okay. Do they, just out of curiosity, do they group up before the program, or do you group them together after?
So it's a combination of both. Oftentimes students come with a team formed, but we also do have a forum where we can say, hey, if you need someone with a sales background or a marketing background or a developer background, we actually do facilitate some connections. So some of the teams do get formed throughout the course of IQ, but many of them do come already formed.
Is UConn the first? I'm sure it's not the first college that facilitates something like this. Are you kind of jumping on the sort of like cultural bandwagon, scholastic bandwagon of kind of promoting entrepreneurship? You know?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm sure there are lots of different colleges and universities that offer these entrepreneurial type programs. IQ specifically did start at Cal Poly, and then Keith and Carson brought it over to UConn. So IQ specifically has been at Cal Poly and UConn, but I'm sure there's other, programs, similar programs, maybe at other places.
Right. Okay. Just curious. Yeah. I mean, I'd love to talk more about just sort of that interests me about, grouping students together. You don't know what their background is. You don't know how they'll get along. I'd love to hear more about your experience with that and just kind of, how the students interact with each other. And maybe if you want to throw into how you interact with them over time and sort of the emotional integrity of grouping people together and if that works or if it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, how do you manage that?
Yeah. Well, fortunately, with IQ, at least, I've seen the students often work very well together in teams, which I've seen as a challenge more so in individual classes. When I was a student, and even some of the classes that I teach, where teams are formed, but not every student necessarily wants to start a business or is necessarily interested in that specific business. So you'll usually have one or two team members carrying the team. Whereas with Innovation Quest, you're specifically interested in starting a business or working on a business. So there's less of the one person carrying the team, although there's usually one person who's the visionary and the driving force. But it actually does get into this emotional intelligence a lot, which is why it was kind of a natural fit for us to integrate CivilTalk into Innovation Quest this year. I talk to the students, again, whether it's a class I'm teaching or specifically IQ, about the importance of team building and the importance of diversity of thought within your team. So oftentimes students think, well, if I have an idea, if I have product market fit, or if I just raise money, I'm set. And they're often surprised when I tell them that's table stakes. Yeah, you need value to provide value in the market with your product or service. You need someone or many customers that are willing to pay in order to really have a sustainable business. But once you've got whatever funding you need, doesn't have to be millions of dollars, but you've got your funding, you've got your idea, you've got your product market fit, it's all about execution. And where I've been involved with startups and student teams that fail, or when they succeed, it's often because the team either gelled or didn't gel. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of conversations we have with the students about making sure that you're focused on hiring the right people, bringing in the right investors, advisors, but that doesn't just mean people that are exactly like you. You need that diversity of thought so that you're challenging each other and making sure that you truly are teasing out what's a good idea, what's a good approach. Maybe are we, thinking about this from all different angles. So you want the diversity of thought, but then you need to be able to coalesce around an idea. Okay, once we've teased this out, we've had our conversations, maybe it's gotten a little heated. Once we stack hands, can we go off and execute without infighting and talking behind each other's back?
Yeah, sort of like huddling around a common goal, and so how do you execute that? If you run into problems with, I think when you leave the ivory tower, when you leave college, it's kind of like the stakes are higher. It's like you have this business and you're like putting all your eggs in one basket and you're just like, maybe have a family to feed and have a root, you have your rent, how do you relay the importance of this to students who might not see the importance of it right now until it kind of like the consequences sort of like hit in later in life,
Yeah, it's such a great question, and it's difficult to teach in a classroom, but I guess I'm able to draw on a lot of experiences. So oftentimes I teach from, here's what I've seen that works, here's what I've seen that doesn't work, and why. So I guess two things that really popped into my head as you asked that question. The first was about building a team of advisors and investors that you can ultimately leverage. So I've talked about being involved with startups where sometimes you're just desperate for the funding and you just try to raise the money however you can. But if you can be a little more discerning, you want to have investors and advisors that can make introductions to you, whether it's raising money or customers or potential other employees, and really leverage them. So one of the most visceral examples I can give is my very first startup. I was 25. I was very green. We'd raised about $750,000, which seemed like a ton of money when you're 25, right? But I would go into my board meetings and my mindset was, how do I survive this board meeting? Like, let me just tell them what they want to hear. Or, I didn't view it as an opportunity to leverage their knowledge and leverage their connections and ask for help. Whereas now, I really look forward to board meetings. I don't think, how do I survive it? I usually have my list of asks. Okay, well, we're going to report out what they want to be reported, but here's all the help I'm going to ask for. And I'm not afraid to say, well, here's what I don't feel like is working. So, I don't know how much of that sticks, but you try to give these examples to the students and hopefully they'll remember some of that. And I keep in touch with them as well. So maybe they'll reach out in 2 years or 5 years or whatever when they
stories at all of students coming out and being like, I succeeded on Shark Tank.
Well, I mean, we've seen, it's almost like 2 a year roughly that do go on to raise significant rounds, and quite a few have gone on to successful exits or just to sustainable businesses. So we certainly see that. I do have students come back from time to time. Hey, we've done a successful seed round. Now we're going after an A. Do you know VCs in our space, or can you make some introductions? Or sometimes it's, we need help hiring. I'm trying to find a certain type of person, and it's difficult as a startup, right? Because you can post a job, but not everybody's chomping at the bit to come work for some startup in Connecticut that they've never heard of and they don't know the people. So yeah, I mean, they come back with all types of different things. Sometimes it's, they want my help advising. Sometimes it's help raising money, or sometimes it's just to, give them another set of eyes on a problem or another idea about how they might approach something.
Right. Do you think over the years, teaching, when you first started an innovation quest, was emotional intelligence something that you had thought about when you were starting, or was it something over time where you were like, I need to integrate this more? I mean, obviously your background, you had to deal with soft skills and understanding civility and social emotional learning to a certain degree, but over time, has that need to implement EQ into the curriculum become more profound, or how was it transitioned, if it did, from beginning to end?
Yeah. It was not something I was thinking about when I started out, and if I'm being honest, when I was a student in the early 2000s, I probably would have poo-pooed it if someone brought it up to me. I think the beauty, or maybe the luck that I had, was I'd gone through this experience. It was 2 startups in a row. The first one had raised 20 or $30 million Series B. We were bringing in all these folks from different places, and we really thought we were well positioned for, to really grow this thing to a big Series C and have a massive exit. And the senior team just did not gel. And I'd say that's the big reason why the company didn't have a big success. Ultimately, there was an exit, but it wasn't really what everyone would have hoped for. And I feel like that was largely because of the team. And then the very next company I went to, they actually required, it wasn't during the interview process, but once I got hired, was to read a book by Patrick Lencioni. I may be pronouncing that wrong, but it was like the 4 obsessions of gosh, I can't remember what it was, but it was all about clarity and building the right team and being able to have, passionate disagreements, but ultimately stacking hands and not doing that infighting, which I kind of referenced earlier. And that company raised a lot less money and had a massive success. And so I wasn't thinking about it in terms of emotional intelligence, but I realized, wow, it is so much about the team. And does this team work well together? Can we have disagreement, but then ultimately stack hands and then go for the next 2 to 3 months until we start planning the next quarter? And it made such a difference. And so I had those experiences. And then as Keith started talking about emotional intelligence and I started thinking about my experiences, I thought, well, gosh, that's exactly where it was missing, the company failed. Where it was present, the company succeeded. And so I started thinking about how important that is in building teams. And so, as much as I can, I thought, well, I do want to integrate this into classroom curriculum and then ultimately IQ. They're those things that they're difficult to teach, kind of similar to negotiation is tough to teach in a classroom. But as much as you can, you help students prepare for these things this is what is going to come up when the rubber meets the road and you're building a company. And so the better we can prepare them for some of what's to come and how to deal with it, when it's smacking you in the face, I think just the better equipped they'll be.
Yeah. What are things that, just going back to your history and time as an entrepreneur, how do you determine, since, you've had success with that, for our listeners, how do you determine who's a good fit? What are the benchmarks for you when you're sitting with a person or in front of a person? Like, I want this person on my team, Yeah,
it's a great question. And interviewing is so hard. It's so important and it's so hard. You can have people that are good interviews, but turn out to not be great employees. You get have people who aren't good at interviewing, but would be good employees. And so oftentimes I look for referrals as much as I can. So if it's a friend, a colleague, an advisor who's worked with someone, that helps to understand, okay, they've got some experience with this person. When I'm interviewing people, I actually like to hear about a failure that they've had and what did they learn from it. I've been involved in different capacities in probably 8 or 9 startups, and people want to hear about the successes, and the successes are certainly more fun, but you learn so much more from the failures, or the quote unquote failures. I think if you learn from the experience, it's not a true failure, but call it a financial failure if it didn't get the return the investors wanted. So I want to hear about that. Where have you failed? What did you learn from that? Because if you truly had this visceral experience, you're not going to make that mistake twice.
Right.
So I do look for that. And it's tough because when you interview people, they don't want to talk about failure. They think that's like a trap, right? You ask, well, what's your biggest weakness? And people say, oh, I work too hard, right? Like,
I'm too punctual.
Okay. Beyond that, yeah. So I don't have a great answer for you, but it's like, those are the types of things I try to tease out in the interview. Sometimes it's good to just get together for a coffee and just have a more casual conversation that's not so specific about how do you work. You just try to get to know the person a little better to see, are they going to gel with the team? Are they comfortable with some disagreement, right? I don't want them to just, if you agree with every single thing I say, then you're probably not going to add a lot of value to the conversation. I need you to have an opposing point of view at times. We need to be able to disagree. So those are the types of things I talk about when I talk to students about interviewing, and those are the types of things I try to do. I don't always succeed at it, but that's what I try to do when I interview.
Yeah, I feel like critical thinking is so important. We don't talk about that a lot in classes, and that's not something that kind of popped up when I was in college too. It wasn't until afterwards I left and had a lot of history with disagreements and being like, okay, conflict is not a bad word.
Right.
Anger is not bad. It's how you display it. There's anger is a totally healthy or conflict. It's totally fine to feel that way and to relay that emotion or feeling, but it's how you do it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I talk about, and I don't know if this is like too trite or something, but like if you have a real emotional reaction to something that happened, what I didn't do when I was younger, and I often do now, is if I feel like my emotions are getting the better of me in a work disagreement, I don't just pick up the phone anymore. I might write a note. I might even draft an email, but I don't send it that day, and I
Right.
sleep on it. And then you go to see, okay, how do I feel about this in the morning? Do I still feel like I need to even have this conversation? And then if yes, I'll probably be more measured when I have it than I would have been if I just picked up the phone. And it's so much more productive if you kind of check your emotions and just try to have, more of a logic. Well, here's how I'm feeling. Here's why I don't like this approach, or here's what you said that bothered me.
Right.
So a lot of times it's just about like pausing, figuring out how do you get that out without displaying it to other people, and then try it again tomorrow.
Yeah. Time is I say this in my interpersonal relationships or business relationship, like time is your greatest asset when you want to get through conflict resolution or in emotional intelligence. Like put some space and time, conscientiousness over impulsivity every time of the day. With anything, you know what I mean? Like that's kind of what separates us between like logical human beings and like primates, to a certain degree. But it's interesting that when I think about this in conjunction with students, and I talk about this with Keith all the time, founder of CivilTalk, is impulsivity with students. Do you have a take on that at all? With like students being so intertwined, especially in 2025, and even more so going forward with social media. CivilTalk is an online platform. Do you see impulsivity levels sort of, I don't know, on the rise? I know UConn is a great school, and so I feel like you have a great selection of students in general, so y'all are really lucky in that regard. But how do you see sort of social media playing a role in emotional intelligence and sort of conscientiousness and impulsivity, and all these things are really important for emotional intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, so I talk about it quite a bit with the students. When it comes to social media, there's a lot of positive that can come from it. I find tools like LinkedIn are great as recruitment tools if you're trying to find people or make connections, whether it's for hiring or maybe trying to make a sale or things like that. But you need to be careful about what are the things you engage with on these platforms as well, because it's there. And oftentimes, even if you delete something, people take screenshots or whatever. So I do talk about it a lot. I'm not a big user of social media, but I certainly see the value and don't discourage students from doing it. You see a lot of folks that build a business off, TikTok or whatever. So we talk about the importance of what is your brand, what are you putting out there, and being a little more reserved. When it comes to using CivilTalk in the classroom, fortunately, we haven't seen any, heated debates or anything going on there, but we do see a lot of great conversation going on, which is great. I think the other piece that I've had to talk with some students about over the years is just setting expectations for when you're reaching out to folks. So we connect them with mentors throughout IQ, and these mentors are giving their time freely. They're not getting paid. These are, experts in their field. Oftentimes they're still working or they're consulting or whatever it is. So they're busy, is my point. And so I'll tell students, when you're reaching out for a 30-minute meeting with a mentor, make sure, one, you don't expect them to respond within the hour or within 30 minutes, right? Like, give them a few days to respond. Let me know if you don't feel like you're getting a fast enough response, and I can maybe help pull them in, but don't start bugging them the next day if you haven't heard from them. And be flexible, right? Like, these are the days I'm available. Don't just give one day with one 30-minute time slot. And I know it sounds like people should just know this, but I mean, it's not always intuitive for students because they're so used to just immediate gratification, and they need to understand, hey, you need to temper your expectations, but you will get a response and it will be thoughtful. You just have to wait a few days, likely.
Right. It'll be a better response with I'm sure your history too, is when you have just this time, this time, this time, this time, and you're working with someone who's like, you're like, okay, I can respect this. You respect my time, so I'm going to respect this meeting. And you're right, it's not something that a lot of people have that ability. You don't think that it's not an issue until you get into that world and you're like, do you respect my time?
Right. And like it's good in your email to say, here are some of the things I'd like to talk about. So give them time to think through it, because if you only have a half an hour, it's going to be most productive if they've had some time to think about it. So let them know what it is that you're grappling with and why you're reaching out to them, and have a real reason. Don't just schedule time with mentors for the sake of scheduling time. Look at their background, make sure that they fit the profile of what you're looking for. Give them a little bit of an idea of what you're trying to get out of the session, and you're going to have a much more productive 30 minutes.
Right. Are you allowed to talk about what kind of businesses your students are sort of making? I'm just curious for our listeners, and just in a broader sense, a lot of our listeners are not going to be UConn attendees, but what are students right now trying to build?
Yeah, I mean, it runs the gamut. There were so many cool ideas this year, and so I'm really just thinking about this year and last year because they're so recent. But one of the students came up with this wearable tech that can monitor lots of different things, not just your heart rate, but and the tech could be silk screened onto a shirt. So it's, better than wearing a wristband or something like that. It becomes part of your attire. We had a student that was focused on boots that were made in Mongolia. She felt she wanted something that was warm but still stylish and waterproof, and didn't like the options that were out there, and so decided to do it on her own. There was a student focused on cancer research and finding ways to stop cancer metastasis. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, but catching it at the pass so that it doesn't spread, and was having some great success with lab trials. So now they were bringing it on to human trials. And just one more I'll give, because this was a great engineering feat, I think, and the student's still at it, where he created at the nanoparticle level a core shell technology where just the shell was made of precious metals, but the core was not. So he was able to bring the cost down by 80% or 90%, something significant at the nanoparticle level. So the customers he was selling to, it could be just as effective a material, but the cost was drastically lower. So, I mean, it runs the gamut, I guess is my point. But there's no shortage of fun ideas, and that's why I've continued to come back year after year after year, because it's always fun and rewarding to work with the students.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're talking about these things, and what's going on in my head is like, I hope they have good EQ. I really hope they know how to have like conversations with their teammates so this can get done. It's just like, if you don't know how to communicate, like, it's not going to work.
Totally. And one of the things I try to preempt, because I've seen this as well, is oftentimes, and not just students, I think entrepreneurs in general, they feel if it was their idea, they need to be the CEO. And I'll say to them, I mean, you can be. And those are a lot of the examples we hear about, the Bill Gateses and the Jeff Bezoses and, Zuckerbergs and things, but they're the exception. And if you really love the tech, maybe you should be the head engineer or the CTO. You don't have to be the CEO. You can hire someone that can deal with the day-to-day business stuff that maybe isn't interesting to you, or maybe isn't your core competence, and that's okay.
Right.
And so that's something I just try to talk about, and I'm sure it goes in one ear and out the other for some. Others, you see the light bulb go off. But that's part of forming your team. Or maybe you are the CEO for the first year or two, but once you hit a certain point, then maybe you transition and you bring in a CEO, but you don't have to be. So those are the types of things you talk about, and you hope that it sticks with some of them.
Right. I mean, that's how it is in day-to-day life, right? You're like, I really hope this sticks to you, Do the dishes. I hope that sticks.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. It's about time, Kevin. Thank you so much for being on the show. As we are wrapping up today with our 30 Minutes with Kevin, I like to tell our listeners to think about civility in their own day-to-day life, what that means to them, and how they can better, use civility and compassion in their day-to-day life. Thank you. We are CivilTalk, www.civiltalk.com. See you guys next time. Thank you, Kevin Gardiner, so much for being here with us.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.